Welcome everyone to the E3G briefing on the G7 Leaders Summit that will start tomorrow in Hiroshima, Japan. We are going to give you an overview of some of the key issues from the climate and energy perspective that we expect to see. And we will be diving deep into each of three topics, the clean energy agenda and the push for decarbonization of all sectors of the global economy. We'll be talking about the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan that we expect to be released in conjunction with the leaders' communique at the end of the summit. And we will talk about the things that we need to see on finance, both climate finance and more broadly. And just to give a little context, of course, this summit is occurring at a time when the world's commitment to limiting temperature increases to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels is in some jeopardy. We see climate impacts mounting around the world. We see a number of countries experiencing debt and fiscal pressures. Of course, we see still the shocks from the Ukraine-Russia war in terms of food and energy security. A lot of people have referred to this as a polycrisis. And I think it's important to note that the clean energy and other solutions to the climate crisis can also address some of these other concerns in terms of energy security, price shocks, and dependence on unreliable sources of energy, such as Russia. Now, the G7 have made it quite clear they want to drive the global transition to a clean energy economy, but to make real progress towards this objective this weekend, we think they need to do several things. First, they need to demonstrate their commitment to scaling up climate ambition at home. You can't really persuade others to follow you if you're not leading. They need to lead on this by decarbonizing their own economies. That means fully decarbonizing their electricity sector by 2035, electrifying their transportation sector, reducing the energy intensity of their economies, and cutting back on their consumption and production of fossil fuels. Now, during the Climate, Energy, and Environment Ministerial of the G7 countries last month, there was agreement on the need to phase out fossil fuels, to set G7 targets on renewables and energy intensity reduction, and a push to prevent Japan's intention to force the use of ammonia and hydrogen co-firing in the thermal power sector. Maria Pastukhova will talk about that in a minute and outline how it's important for leaders to reflect and respect this already agreed upon outcome and build on it and make sure there is no backsliding on this domestic clean energy transition. Second, countries need to demonstrate their willingness to partner with major developing countries to build resilient, affordable, and sustainable global clean energy supply chains that can reduce dependence on unreliable fossil fuels and benefit workers and local communities. And Jonny will be talking in a minute about the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan and what we need to see, not just from that, but to implement it. It's important to note that leaders from Brazil, India, Indonesia, several other developing countries will be joining the G7 leaders for portions of this weekend summit, and they will likely view the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan as a positive initiative, but I'm sure that they will be pressing G7 leaders for more specifics on how exactly they intend to deliver on this pledge. And finally, we need to see a commitment by the G7 leaders to mobilizing much greater public and private financial flows, as is needed to decarbonize the global economy in line with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. We've heard a lot of talk, of course, are the developed countries meeting their commitment to mobilize $100 billion per year, as was pledged in Copenhagen in 2009. That's important as a matter of trust and keeping their commitments. But the reality is we need to mobilize trillions of dollars per year if we are going to help the global south decarbonize in line with 1.5C, and we need substantial amounts of money as well for dealing with the impacts of climate change. And on that point, we think the leaders need to demonstrate solidarity with vulnerable countries that are suffering ever more intense climate impacts by indicating how they intend to fulfill the pledge they made in Glasgow a year and a half ago to double provision of adaptation finance to $40 billion annually by 2025, up from the current $20 billion, reiterating their commitment to operationalizing the loss and damage fund that was agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 last year, and signaling their intention to mobilize innovative sources of finance for loss and damage, including in support of this new fund. So we've got a lot to talk about. I would encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will address those after we've had introductory remarks by each of the three speakers. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Maria Pastukhova.
Many thanks, Alden. I'll have a very quick go over the G7 energy and decarbonization targets and commitments we can expect and changes we can expect out of the climate and energy ministers. But I'll try to keep it short and looking forward to the questions afterwards. So what we have seen in the climate and energy ministers is the increasing isolation of Japan on energy issues across the board, be it the power sector goal, be it the approach to ammonia, hydrogen, be it investments into the gas sector. We have seen clear progress on all of these fronts, but really showing that Japan is still pushing hard to not commit to more progressive targets on power sector goal, to which the G7 has committed last year as predominantly decarbonized power systems. By 2035 this year, we have a fully or predominantly decarbonized power systems by 2035, which clearly shows that the large majority of the group is keen to increase the commitment and to commit to really net zero power systems, a benchmark that has been introduced by the International Energy Agency within its net zero power emissions net zero emissions roadmap. The predominantly caveat has been left in also as a signal that Japan is still keen to push back on this. And we have seen in the media reactions in the Japanese media that some Japanese stakeholders have interpreted the predominant language as over 50% of clean energy, which is of course not acceptable for other G7 countries. So what we definitely need at the leaders is first of all reiteration of this commitment to a fully decarbonized power system by 2035, but also if any caveats are left in, then there needs to be a clear reassurance that a predominantly decarbonized power system means an overwhelmingly high amount of clean energy, be it renewables or nuclear. We know that is a contested issue within the countries, with the US and France and Japan having some share of nuclear, but the high share of clean energy is key there. And we're not talking about 50%, we're talking about 80%, over 80% at least. That's where the real systemic change needs to happen. That's what the G7 countries need to commit to. Same on hydrogen and ammonia co-firing. We have seen clearly in the communique by the energy ministers that the G7 countries acknowledge that some might resort to ammonia co-firing and using hydrogen in the power generation sector, but they're clearly committed to prioritizing hydrogen and ammonia use in hard-to-abate sectors, hydrogen in particular in energy-intensive industry and heavy transport and aviation. What really needs to happen at leaders is here as well for G7 countries to ensure that any mention of hydrogen and ammonia includes restrictions and guardrails to prevent any misuse of this quite energy-intensive and expensive fuels in any sectors where there are alternatives. And if ammonia for power generation is considered at all, as Japan would like to consider it, it must be aligned with the 1.5 pathway and the G7 goal to decarbonize the power sector by 2035. Finally, what we have seen as a clearly positive step in this year's climate and energy ministerial is the first explicit call for an end of new construction of coal-fired power generation globally. This commitment clearly needs to find its way into the leader's statement, also to signal the growing trend away from new coal-fired power generation outside of China, the only country with a pipeline of coal power plants is still growing. And it was, of course, it would also put a bigger scrutiny at Japan, who would need to stop issuing new permits for coal power plant construction and committing to end coal construction and supporting other countries to do so would be furthermore also an important foundation for further no-new coal commitments at the upcoming diplomacy moments, be it the United Nations Climate Ambition Summit in September or COP28. The most probably contested and most hotly discussed topic, gas, is still being discussed. We cannot say what will come out at leaders. What we have seen in the energy ministers is that the G7 countries have voiced much weaker support for new gas investments. They have clearly signaled that reducing gas demand and accelerating clean energy are the key instruments towards more gas security or security of gas supply, not new investments in the sector. They've furthermore indicated that any new investments need to be aligned with the climate targets, de facto excluding any investments in upstream gas. What needs to happen at leaders is clearly retaining the language on the need for reducing gas demand and accelerating clean as the quickest way to maintain liquidity of the gas markets, which are quite tight at the moment and will remain so in the midterm. But also what is needed is more clarity on what this language on potential need for new investments in gas means, because Japan, as in the language with the power sector goal, interprets it in its own way. And we have seen in the media again that Japanese major companies, as well as the Japanese government, see that as a clear endorsement for new investments in upstream gas. And that is not what other countries are saying. We have heard the French minister right after the climate and energy ministerials that this commitment de facto excludes any new upstream money in the sector. This needs to be made explicit at leaders. I would probably stop here. There are some issues on public finance going into fossil fuels and the G7 countries maintaining the Glasgow Pledge on finance, but maybe I can come back to that in the Q&A session. And back to you, Alden.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maria. That was great. We can also talk in the Q&A in the discussion session how the renewable energy commitments in the ministerial declaration relate to the call by some, particularly the EU, for a global renewable energy deployment target to be set at COP28 in Dubai. I know that's got a lot of energy, a lot of attention, some support from the incoming presidency in the UAE, so that might be something of interest as well. Well, you've been seeing a lot of coverage about the Inflation Reduction Act, about the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in Europe, about onshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, de-risking, decoupling, any pick your verb, as countries try to come to grips with the scale of the transformation that's going to be needed to pivot to a truly decarbonized global economy, well, dealing with the political realities of important sectors and communities and workers at home that need to be brought along in this transition and dealt with in an equitable way. And what you're going to see come out this weekend in this clean energy economy action plan is an attempt by the G7 to put forward a framework for this discussion with major developing countries. Obviously, a lot of this is aimed at reducing the current, what is seen by many as over-reliance on a few countries for clean energy technologies, for critical minerals, rare earths. Obviously, China is very high on that list, but it will not be mentioned in the text. Russia as well. And of course, the analogy is that we don't want to see the clean energy revolution and transition held hostage in the same kind of way that Russia tried to hold Europe hostage with weaponizing natural gas. So this is going to be a very interesting discussion. And we have one of our best experts on the call, Jonny Peters, who can unpack all of this for you, tell you how it fits into some of these trends that we've been seeing. There's obviously been some food fights amongst the G7 between the US and the EU, with Japan and with other non-G7 allies like Korea around this. I think this is a signal that they're trying to heal over their own divisions and come forward with a set of rules of the road or guardrails that can be socialized with major emerging economies and sort of change the landscape. So Jonny, if you want to give us a little bit more about both the context for this and how you think this plan will be received and what we'll be looking for in terms of implementation commitments to make it real, that would be great.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Alden. And yeah, that was the perfect introduction to exactly where this is coming from. So thanks so much. I'll probably take that in the reverse order, given that you've given it such a good introduction already. But I think the first thing to say in terms of what G7 leaders might be saying on climate and trade and on the clean energy economy action plan in particular is that of course it's incredibly welcome that G7 leaders plan to make their clearest statement yet on the supporting role that trade and trade policy can make to support decarbonisation. I think some interesting bits on there around trade and climate measures, industrial decarbonisation, the hard to abate sectors, supply chain resilience, like you said, critical raw materials, and investment in clean energy as well. So lots in there to unpack. And I think the things that we can expect to see when it comes to kind of reducing emissions through trade policy, I think really some of this is venturing out from that space around managing tensions around the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, but moving now towards a place where the G7 is accepting that there can be some flexibility of approaches among the G7 countries to begin with, and moving on, I think, to find a more constructive agenda that they can work on together. And really interestingly, mandating the OECD to work on embedded carbon methodologies as a place to start is something that we are expected to see and is quite interesting in this space. This builds already on some of the developments that were happening as well around the G7 Climate Club in Germany as well as a kind of forum for tackling some of the knotty issues around industrial decarbonisation as well among the G7, but also working with partner countries as well. So some positive movement there on reducing emissions through trade policy itself. Then I think really interestingly on establishing resilient global supply chains, I think this is exactly what you were nodding to before, Alden, in terms of the move towards supply chain resilience, moving away from some key dominant actors in the critical mineral space, moving to diversify supply chains. Interestingly, I think lots of stuff potentially in here around public-private partnerships to move into this space. Obviously, the private sector actually already doing a lot of this stuff already. So it's in some respects the public sector playing a little bit of catch up here. Some interesting stuff that we expect to see around mandating the IEA, the International Energy Agency, to do further work on this space, setting up some roadmaps and so on, which I think is incredibly constructive, and I would say much more constructive than potentially some of the mood music that was originally going into the G7 before around potentially a critical raw materials club, a kind of buyers club type model, which was coming out from some European actors before, but essentially I think that's a particularly kind of dangerous way that things could have gone, because it essentially becomes a kind of strong arming club and a way of strong arming countries into the kind of supply chain movement that the G7 wants to see. And I think some of that stuff can potentially end up being quite dangerous. So some positive movement, I think, in terms of where some of this stuff is going to in comparison to where it seems to have been going before on critical raw materials. Just a quick note to say some of this will be supported, I think, Sima is going to come into some of this stuff as well, but will be supported by some action coming out of G7 finance ministers around investing in resilient and inclusive supply chain enhancement. RISE is the acronym for that one, but I'll let her come into some of that stuff already. But it's really good to see the finance space also pushing in a similar direction when it comes to supply chain resilience for critical raw materials. I would say, I think there's potentially, given that there's positive movement on the finance side, I would say actually on the trade side of things specifically, I think this has sort of been slightly undercooked, and this is a sign that this is a kind of newer area for the G7 to be moving into at the moment. But expecting them really just to cover old ground on potentially liberalizing environmental goods and services in this space. But we know that this is essentially a bit of a dead end. We've seen that the WTO discussions on liberalizing environmental goods and services have been stalled since 2016. I think the pathway for this to really kind of build much further into a positive direction from the G7, I think, is probably quite limited. Instead, I think we should be thinking about how the trade system should be supporting some of that work in the finance space, thinking particularly about, for instance, the WTO's Aid for Trade mechanism, how that can be supporting adaptation and resilience in this space. So using that kind of ODA financing to shore up more resilience particularly for LDCs and so on, I think would be positive to see, as well as leveraging export finance. Maria's already spoken about implementing the Glasgow Statement, but I think much more from trade actors actually throwing their weight behind trade finance and financing clean, I think would be a more positive thing to be seeing, rather than going over old ground in the WTO around trying to liberalize some of these things, which, as I said before, is a little bit of a dead end. The last area just to cover here, I think, is around investment in third countries and third country partners. I think, to be honest, we're expecting the G7 to cover old ground here. Expecting them to reiterate language around the JETPs, language around the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, the PGII. I think, essentially in some of these areas, we're already witnessing a bit of a delivery problem. We've seen successive G7s come up with statements in this space, but we're not seeing the money kind of leaving the door at the scale that we need to see. And as I said before, there's much more that could be done if we're really talking about trade in this space, using the trade system to leverage this stuff further. So where does this stuff leave us? Just to kind of recap, given some of that background that Alden already set out, I think it is it's positive to see G7 leaders coming to a welcome, but I would say a bit of an uneasy truce around trade and climate change, and the beginnings of an agenda around trade and climate at the G7. But I've mentioned some of the kind of tensions around carbon border adjustments already, but obviously the elephant in the room is the fallout from the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and the kind of tit for tat that we had between the EU and the US going into the G7 before this. So while it's positive that we're seeing stuff regrouping around the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan, expecting some of the language around subsidies, green subsidies, to be possibly the weakest that we will see in this space, really. I mean, the fact that the G7 can't even really agree to call it subsidies, they're going to call it language around incentives and so on, speaks volumes around some of the tensions around this space. But I think really, if we're going to try to move towards transformational impact in this space and leveraging the trade system truly for its real value in this space, then we've got to be talking about things like green subsidies at the WTO, getting the G7 to set a positive mandate for some of this stuff, not just talking about some kind of internal transparency among the G7 on green subsidies, which is where I think this stuff will land, but really talking about uploading this stuff to the multilateral system, using the trade system to really actually, in a sense, make sure that we're not shutting other countries out of the global green subsidy race, which is the real danger here. And we'll expect language from the G7 around not doing that, but I'm not expecting much in the way of concrete outcomes in terms of how they really do remedy this stuff. But a lot of the answers will really be in uploading some of this stuff to the multilateral trade space and talking about trade reform. So really, we want clarity, transparency on green subsidies at the WTO. We want a better definition of the policy space that emerging economies have. Talking about, for instance, better language around how we interpret special and deferential treatment at the WTO in this context, to really make sure countries aren't being shut out of the green subsidy race, and not just kind of reiterating some of this stuff that we've seen before around offers of finance that have not really got out the door in the investment space. And finally, more of a focus, I think, on technology access and technology transfer, I think will be really important to see, particularly for clean energy in developing countries, bringing some of those discussions that we're seeing in the UNFCCC closer to the WTO and unlocking some of those trade-related aspects by doing that. So really, as I say, some of this stuff is actually starting to venture into some of the discussions that we're getting more used to seeing in the finance space and the reform of the multilateral and the global financial architecture. So really talking about how do we have this conversation around trade as well. We're seeing the beginnings of some of this stuff in the Bridgetown agenda. It's great to see the Bridgetown agenda now talking about trade as one of its sort of final bullet points as part of the repackaged Bridgetown agenda going into this. We're not necessarily seeing the G7 rising to this challenge yet. I think that in terms of the future development of this Clean Energy Economy Action Plan, I think that is the space that we need to be moving into in the future. But I know we're about to hand over to another colleague who can touch on some of this stuff in more detail.
Yeah,
So,
thanks a lot, Jonny. That was brilliant. I'm sure you generated a lot of questions from people when we get to that section. You may have noticed, if you're listening carefully, a common thread running through my opening remarks, through Maria's remarks and Jonny's, which is the F word, finance. And this has been a perennial topic since these negotiations started over 30 years ago in the run-up to Rio. As many of you know, I've been a perennial inhabitant of this space for that time. And I actually brought a button to Sharm el-Sheikh last year that the Climate Action Network had prepared for the Durban summit in South Africa in 2011. I'll just hold it up here so you can see. WTF, where's the finance? And that question was just as relevant in Sharm el-Sheikh as it was in Durban, as it was in Rio. And we even got the Egyptian climate champion Mahmoud Mieldin to wear this button around in Sharm el-Sheikh for a few days, which created a bit of a stir. But We have one of the world's experts on all things finance with us, Sima Kammourieh, and is going to talk about not just the climate finance elements of what we need to see from the leaders, but the broader financial system transformation elements. And she will explain to you where we are going into this meeting in terms of the G7 finance ministers meeting in Niigata last month, and what we need to see from leaders to build confidence and true partnership with developing countries on the road ahead. So Sima, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alden, and thank you also to Jonny for some of his comments. And yeah, I guess I wanted to pick up on, actually, Jonny and Alden were just both vibing very much in the same direction, so that makes it really easy for me to pick up where they left off and to say that the number one thing that we need to see from G7 leaders now in Hiroshima is exactly what both Jonny and Alden have been saying, perhaps in slightly different words than the ones I'm going to use now. But what we need to see is simply a systemic whole of finance reform approach. So what Alden has been saying is, until now, we've been approaching the F word through the angle of climate finance, but we've now, it's been a little bit of time since we've all moved on from that, in the sense that we know that this is just not going to be enough. Alden has said it. It's not about billions, it's trillions that we need, and we need to change all of finance and need to make sure that basically the money that is absolutely critical moves to the right places and moves at the right scale, right? And so the issue is, how do we get that done? How do we make sure that we have that? Because there will be no transition without the money moving to the right places at the right scale. And so this is really the finance agenda, is really what the finance ministers of the G7 should have resolved in Niigata last weekend. They met in Niigata May 11th to 13th, and they published their communique on Saturday. Unfortunately, what we saw coming out of the finance ministers was a real letdown on all three pillars of that systemic financial reform agenda that we need. And I'll get back to what we need to see. What did we actually get out of Niigata, and what are the gaps that are left for the leaders to fill in? So I just said that there were three pillars. So what are these three pillars of the finance agenda for climate? Number one is the public finance pillar for the global south. And this is really about the climate finance first and foremost. Absolutely, we need to get that job done. But it's also about the international financial architecture piece. I'll get back to that. That's pillar number one. So public finance for the low middle income countries to be able to achieve the transition they need. The pillar number two is, so to speak, public finance at home, right? So public finance tools and plans for G7 countries themselves. And pillar number three is private finance for all. So let's get back to these three pillars and see what G7 finance ministers gave us and where they're leaving us, where they're leaving their leaders, rather. So on climate finance, I'll be very brief on that, because I have the feeling that that's the topic that's generally the most well-known and that's the most covered by the media, but we know where the gaps are. Alden has mentioned a lot of it in his intro, so I don't want to spend too much time on that, but we know that we need to be meeting the pledges. We know that we need to be moving forward with the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, and that it's absolutely critical to get that piece done and all of the elements of climate finance fully developed in order to be able to rebuild trust adequately. So that's the number one thing that we need to see. Generally speaking, on the public finance for the Global South pillar, the G7 finance ministers, I would say, said the right words. So that agenda was nicely reflected in their communique. There's, generally speaking, I would say, very good awareness across the board in the policy and the political space regarding that agenda, because it's crystal clear that we have a trust deficit, and it's crystal clear that we need to get that agenda met and fleshed out, and we need to move from commitments to actions in order to be able to move forward. So we did see finance ministers talk about not just climate finance, but also talk about more structural issues around international financial architecture, such as the needed evolution we need to see from multilateral development banks, what we need to see in terms of multilateral development banks, not just evolving in their mission, but better coordinating with one another as a system. And we did see the language that we needed to see on special drawing rights, on the new pledges that have been made by Japan out of the spring, France and others, and encouraging others to follow suit. And we also saw an acknowledgement or recognition that sovereign debt continues to be a problem. However, when it comes to sovereign debt itself, we are really still running against a conundrum, which is that to durably resolve sovereign debt issues, we need to find ways to get other creditors that are not just official sovereign creditors, but also private creditors to the restructuring table. And this is still a difficult question that needs to be resolved. So I just wanted to point that out. But generally speaking, the G7 finance ministers painted a reasonably good picture of that public finance agenda for the Global South. But as always, what's needed now is to move on from words to stronger action, especially in the run-up to the summit that's going to be held in Paris in just a month, which is the summit for a new global financial pact. And we're going to need to see stronger commitments and more concrete actions from the G7 leaders in Hiroshima in the run-up to that summit in Paris for good results. And I'm happy to get back to that a little bit and to unpack some of it. I think one of the critical things that we really need to see from G7 leaders, and then I'll wrap it up on that pillar, is a real profound understanding from leaders that the international financial institutions as we have it need to be profoundly transformed. And that we don't just have the Macron summit or Macron-Modi summit or summit for a new global financial pact coming up, but we've also got the Bretton Woods anniversary coming up next year. And we've all been talking about Bretton Woods 2.0 and how the Washington consensus no longer works. Leaders themselves have been talking about it. They need to put concrete actions behind their words. So we really need to go from step A to step Z on that first pillar, really. On the second pillar, which is public finance at home, that should be the real bread and butter of finance ministers. And yet there was really very little to see in their communique, shockingly so. Jonny was talking about the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan and the fact that it's putting a critical issue on the table. But as he said, it's not entirely clear what these words are going to translate into. And in terms of the finance part of it, it's not entirely clear that we have a real commitment from the G7 to even coordinate amongst each other on the use of public finance tools such as subsidies and other things. We absolutely want those things to be discussed at the multilateral level, as Jonny was saying. It's critical for green subsidies to be brought back into the WTO system, as Jonny was saying. But do we even have, step one of this, which is a commitment from the G7 countries themselves to coordinate better on the use and leverage of their own public finance tools at home for decarbonization? That's not totally clear. We did see some language from G7 finance ministers in April in an informal statement that they published after the spring meetings. But there was actually nothing about that in their communique on Saturday, and that's really worrisome. So they did talk about the RISE partnership that Jonny briefly mentioned, and that is mostly about how do we make sure that low and middle income countries are not taken out of this equation when G7 countries seek to relocalize supply chains at home. So how do we make sure that this is done in a way that's inclusive and sustainable? But there was not much to be seen beyond that on G7 countries committing to talk to each other about their own industrial plans to start with. And this is really quite worrisome. And I think Jonny was talking about an uneasy truce. Excellent choice of words. We're still very much in that situation. And we have this initiative that's underway at the multilateral level. And at the same time, we're seeing Canada, fighting tooth and nail to secure the Volkswagen deal a few weeks ago, or Macron giving a critical speech about the need to reindustrialize France just 10 days ago. So this is the mood. It's uneasy. It's uneasy. I'll just paraphrase Jonny there. I couldn't phrase it better than he did. The truce is uneasy. So let's see how it moves forward. And G7 leaders definitely need to pick up where their finance ministers failed, and to say we're gonna do our homework. We're gonna coordinate amongst each other on the use of public finance tools, on subsidies, and we are going to re-inject trust in the multilateral trade system as well. And then escalate that discussion at the multilateral WTO level, what have you. Now, the final thing is that the leaders have a lot of cleaning up to do from what their finance ministers did on the private finance front. So private finance for all, pillar number 3. There's absolutely no way, and we all know this by now, that we can achieve the transition if private financial flows are not aligned with our collective decarbonization goals. And there are a few basic building blocks in terms of reforms that we need. And those are very well identified. And basic building block number 1 is that we need a common, ambitious, globalized framework for disclosures. And we saw a lot of language backsliding from finance ministers on that this weekend. We have something called the International Sustainability Standards Board that is going to be publishing disclosure framework standards in just a month. And until recently, G7 finance ministers acknowledged that whatever came out of the ISSB was going to constitute a global baseline that they were then going to be working off of for their own disclosure standards. That language has disappeared. And we've seen regression in terms of language from accepting a global baseline to committing to consistency, comparability, interoperability. Those are all lesser words than accepting a global baseline. So let's get the leaders to recognize how critical the private finance agenda is, and to strengthen it again by re-injecting commitments into disclosures, for example, to start with. And then there are many other items that they could pick up in terms of the private finance, and I don't want to spend too much time on this here, but one big item that's made its way into the G7 finance communique, it was also in the G7 climate and energy ministers communique in April, is the recognition that transition planning, especially for the private sector, but also for the public sector, is actually an extremely important tool that needs to be leveraged. But we're still far from what we need to see, which is mandatory transition planning across the private sector, right? We need to see the plans, and then we need to be able to hold the private sector accountable to those plans. But again, we cannot get the finance moving in the right direction without that. So those are the 3 pillars, and this is the homework that we need to see checked off by the leaders in Hiroshima. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Sima. That was great, really comprehensive, and thanks to Jonny and Maria too. I think you've set the stage for some good questions. We've got a couple of questions already have come in. Just to remind you, if you do have a question, please put your name and your outlet and put the question in the chat. So first question I'll tee up is from Tim Stickings from the National. He says, taking up what Alden said, what, if anything, are we expecting G7 leaders to do to give a push to the idea of a global renewable energy target at COP28, which I mentioned? Maria, do you want to take a crack at that, to say how we would like to see the leaders build on what the ministers did to move towards a global RE target?
Sure. So there are several things that G7 leaders can do. One of them is, of course, at the leaders summit to reiterate their own their own collective target, which is, we know is not a new ambition, but a very strong signal of their own commitment to deliver on what has already been promised, and a call for a global renewables energy target in the text of the communique would be a good first push ahead of the COP28 conference. What is really needed for the G7 leaders after the summit is, of course, to create confidence of other countries in renewables targets and in renewables as an energy source that contributes to economic and energy systems resilience, and that they can do by first clearly showing domestic delivery. We have countries within the G7 group that already have started to take some positive steps forward. The US, for example, has recently released proposed regulations targeting greenhouse gas emissions from new and existing fossil power plants, which would de facto ban or dramatically lessen the amount of gas-fired and ban coal-fired power plants past 2030. Other countries come forward with their own policies and targets. Japan is the biggest gap right now in terms of their own policies and targets, particularly on renewables. Japan right now presents I think a study came out yesterday that says by Ember that says that Japan's share in the overall 150 gigawatt wind target is only 4% of the total G7, and it is clear that Japan is underusing its vast offshore wind potential and is therefore losing a race for decarbonized electricity. So there is definitely room for Japan to develop much further. So clearly showing domestic delivery. The second thing that needs to be done, and that can be done by the set of upcoming diplomacy moments, is to create confidence of emerging markets and developing economies that a global renewables target is not just there to make sure already mature markets and markets that already have the means to ramp up these renewables capacities, be it US, Japan, be it US, the G7, China, or the EU or India even, that it is not only these countries that get to contribute to this target, but this target actually empowers the emerging markets and developing economies to go over to clean energy systems and to boost their economic and energy systems resilience by accelerating clean. So there are several moments for the G7 to do so and to come forward with some reassuring announcements. One of them is the upcoming G20. Then we have the Kenya's Africa Climate Summit in September, a very important moment where the G7 countries can clearly come forward with offers of support for some African countries to ramp up their own renewable electricity capacity. We have furthermore the IEA Climate and Energy Summit in September that the Spanish EU presidency will hold, where not just G7 but the EU can also offer themselves in a very strong position as a supporter of renewables ramp up in the global south. And of course there is COP. So I would say for G7 the task is not just to come strong out as leaders with their commitment to deliver on their own renewables and to call out for global renewables target, but also it is an ongoing task between now and COP28 to show a continuing support, particularly for developing countries, to enable this rollout in conditions where it might not be as easy and as fast as in industrialized countries.
Thanks a lot, Maria. That was great, a lot there. I'll take this next question, which is from Studi Mishra at The Independent. Do you think that the kind of urgency that is expected from G7 at this point for 2030 targets is visible or getting enough push? If not, why? Well, Studi, I mean, this has been a big push for the G7, the EU and the US in particular, is for other countries, particularly large emerging economies, to step up their game, noting that many of them have not refined or upgraded their targets since Paris in 2015. As I said at the beginning, to do that credibly, the G7 has to have its own act together at home. They have to show that they're walking the talk, that they're moving towards decarbonizing their economies. And also, as Jonny and Sima both said, they need to show that they will truly partner with these emerging economies by mobilizing the public and private sector resources that are needed. Just to give one example, I've seen figures that to get India moving in line with scaling up renewable energy and starting to be able to retire enough coal to get on track for 1.5 would take somewhere around $30 billion a year, perhaps more. Sima may know the exact figure, but we're talking a lot of money here, well above, as I said, the $100 billion. So a lot of this comes back to finance. So we will see how this push goes. There will be the first dialogue of the mitigation work program under the UNFCCC held just before the bond negotiations start in early June. That's going to be focused on how do we reduce the barriers to dramatically accelerating deployment of clean, renewable energy and efficiency technologies. We'll see how that experiment goes, but there's a lot of work to be done on this front. There's a couple of questions here which I'm going to give together to Sima. One is from Will Worley at DevEx. Do you have thoughts on how the Paris Finance Reform Summit is shaping up? And does it matter that it clashes with the UK's summit for Ukraine? Second question is from Zach Coleman with Politico. He asks, with the US Export-Import Bank approving $100 million in financing for an oil refinery in Indonesia last week, what does that say about the durability of commitments nations made in Glasgow to end financing for overseas oil and gas projects? So Sima, one question on the upcoming Paris summit and another one on the credibility of the G7 finance phase out commitment.
Thank you, Alden. And I think Sarah also has her hand up. So I'll answer the first question briefly, then I'll give the second one actually to Maria, and maybe we could then go to Sarah's question. Paris Finance Reform Summit is shaping up well in the sense that we're seeing, I think, the right kind of energy and pushes from France to try to make it a success, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. We're hearing some positive things about outcomes on the private finance side with potentially a new tax on certain sectors. So that could be definitely interesting, but I think there still needs to be a lot of work from the French side in collaboration with partners, both on the official sector side and CSOs, to really get to very strong outcomes where there are very, very clear actions and new results, new structural systemic results that come out of this. And I think the G7 leaders is actually going to be excellent testing ground for that. It's obviously not ideal that it's clashing with any other initiative. And my understanding is that the French are still very much making the rounds and corralling their partners to finalize attendance and make sure that attendance is at the highest, best quality possible, which will, of course, ensure a certain, certain impact of the summit. But yeah, we're 6 weeks off, 5 weeks off. There's still quite a lot of work to make sure that we have strong headline outcomes that are not just about pledging to meet the 100 billion, whether it's on climate finance or on SDRs. It needs to be much bigger picture than that, much more structural than that. And yeah, there's still, again, on the diplomacy, engagement, outreach front, there's still lots of work that's being done by the French. Maybe Maria can pick up the Indonesia question.
Yeah,
sure,
go for it, Maria.
Very quickly, as you probably have followed out of the climate and energy ministers, the Glasgow statement has been reconfirmed, and the G7 have even stated that they have ended, in fact, international public fossil fuel finance by the end of the last year. But the commitments are, in fact, only as good as delivery. And until now, we have seen that the delivery has been lacking, with several countries out of the G7 group continuing international public finance or giving international public finance into fossil fuels in third countries, Italy, Germany, and the US among them. And this, of course, they need to be called out on that. And given that the commitment still stands and the countries are, in fact, developing their own national policies now to determine what kind of exceptions are acceptable and climate compatible, and what kind of institutions need to adhere to the Glasgow statement, the commitment works, as in it forces the countries to develop their own policies, to restrict their own international finance, to direct it into clean energy sources. But there are still things on which GSAO need to work, and particularly in the US case, it is clear that the EXIM does not perceive, as of now, the US call for ending international public fossil finance as applicable to itself. They don't see themselves as the public financing institution covered by this commitment, and that's a homework that the US government still has to take up and has to make clear that EXIM actually falls within the institutions that need to stop international public finance into fossil fuels. They in fact adopted a policy on May 11th, but it is not public yet. So they need to make this policy public, and they need to make sure it is explicit in that policy that EXIM is part of these restrictions, so that no further investments can go into oil and gas in third countries. And US is not the only country that's problematic, though. Germany, for example, has not presented any policy yet. They're still developing it, and we know that gas is one of the most contentious issues within the German thinking. So also there, Germany needs to be called out on lack of progress, because they should have developed by the end of the last year as promised, and they should come forward with a new and transparent policy as soon as possible. Back to you, Alden.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maria. That was great. Sarah has a hand up, so we'll unmute Sarah to ask her question, and then we'll take the questions that have been submitted from Megan Rowling and Urmi Goswami. Sarah.
Hi, thanks. I'll be quick. I just had a question about the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan. I mean, how much of that do you see as an effort by the G7 to counter China? I know China's not mentioned in it, but is this really an effort to push back against China? And how aligned are G7 countries in that effort? And then just on finance, I wonder, are we expected to see any momentum there, given sort of fiscal constraints among G7 members?
So Jonny, why don't you take the SEEP question? We're going to have to come up with a better acronym for this. I think it's hard to say 5 times fast without stumbling, but we'll let you take that one about SEEP and China, and then Sima, if you want to address what we are likely to see given the fiscal pressures in the G7 countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the short answer is obviously that is the kind of macro context behind all of this stuff. And so I think it's very fair to join the dots in terms of the motivations for the G7 in this space. I mean, you know, we're kind of quite familiar with the US's standpoint on this stuff, where quite an explicit kind of moving away from China focus in some of what it's trying to do in green investments and so on is quite overt. I think for European partners, it's slightly more, the motivations are a slightly different space. I think they often talk about de-risking rather than kind of fully moving away from China. But I think there is quite a clear landing zone here that the diversification and increased resilience of supply chains is a kind of landing zone, a zone of kind of common agreement for the G7. So I think that is why they've kind of quite comfortably come together around a lot of this stuff. So it's fair to give it that kind of macro context, but I think there are other motivations behind wanting to ensure resilience in supply chains as well. It's not just about diversification from China. Like, ultimately, the demand for critical materials and so on is going up as well, and there's a need for increased resilience in supply chains based on that. Obviously, we've got the legacy of the pandemic as well, so other motivations there. We've learned quite a lot of things now, and I think we actually will expect to see the G7 being quite explicit around the lessons from the pandemic and in needing to shore up kind of resilience in supply chains. And of course, it's quite a clear area for partnership with other countries as well, given moves towards friendshoring and so on as well. So yes, of course, the China stuff is important, but it's not the only driver for sure.
Thanks, Jonny. That was great. Sima.
Yeah, the fiscal pressures are absolutely there, Sarah, and you're right to point them out. And they may, they may dampen appetites, especially given the conversations that are going on right now in the US around the debt ceiling and so on. It doesn't mean that they're an excuse, in the sense that there are many things you can, that you can still do about your fiscal policy tool, in the sense that, you can change the way you use it within a certain level. It's also about, the way you decide to structure your fiscal policy and the quality of your fiscal policy. It's not all just about the money and the quantity. There's also discussions that need to be had and a realization that needs to be had. And I think the realization is there, but you're right to point out that there are political constraints sometimes, but the political constraints are no excuse for the fact that we need to rethink the quality of our fiscal policy and our fiscal approach. And that also points to the fact that it's critical that we think of our policy tools in the long term. So there are immediate pressures, or the debt ceiling issue that needs to be resolved by the US in the very short term. That doesn't mean, again, that you have to stop yourself from thinking about the long term and the directionality and the quality in a structural way of your fiscal policy. That's what I would say. So it's still, G7 finance ministers, but if they're not doing it, then their leaders are still very much on the hook for discussing that and discussing, okay, well, how are we rethinking this in the long term? How are we going to use our fiscal policy tools to invest in the right kind of way, to do it in the right kind of coordinated approach? And what does that mean about the future sustainability of our sovereign debt? And is our understanding of what a sustainable debt is actually going to change? Like, these are the kinds of structural questions and thinkings that we need to, and conversations that the leaders need to have, regardless of the fiscal pressure. And actually, having this conversation is very likely to actually resolve the fiscal pressure in reality. So that's also true, by the way, for the global South countries who are also facing fiscal pressures. But yeah.
Thanks a lot, Sima. And I would just note that Sarah, it's really not a question of whether the money is there. Clearly, if you look at the response of the G7 first to the COVID crisis, where they mobilized trillions almost overnight to stabilize their economies, or the war in Ukraine, where I think it's been north of 200 billion has been mobilized to support Ukraine, money is available. It's a question of political will. If leaders truly believe climate change is an existential crisis which threatens their economy and the well-being of their people, they need to step up to the plate and mobilize the resources that are needed and give the kind of incentives to the private sector that Sima was talking about. We had Mark Carney in Glasgow saying there was $130 trillion under management of asset managers available to go into the net zero revolution. So the money is there. The question is how to get it off the sidelines and into the game in alignment with the Paris temperature goals. And that's going to be a major focus, I think, not just at this summit, but the rest of the moments this year. Megan Rowling from Thomson Reuters has a question. There are concerns there could be a trade-off between a renewable energy goal and a phase out, phase down of fossil fuels at COP28. Do you see this as a risk? I'll take that one, Megan. Yes, it is a big risk. We need to have both. It's not either or. We need to see a massive scale up of renewables, a scale up of energy intensity reductions, a scale up of storage and truly clean hydrogen and other technologies and sources. But we also need to see a phase down, phase out of fossil fuels. If you take the IPCC report saying that we need to reduce emissions 43% by 2030 to have a chance of staying within the 1.5C temperature goal, and you take the latest IEA numbers about carbon emissions from the energy and industrial sector, it implies that we need a reduction of about 15 gigatons or more in fossil fuel emissions, just carbon. Put methane on top of that, it's even higher. At best, probably CCS and carbon dioxide removal technologies by 2030, which is very near term, can deliver perhaps a gigaton, perhaps a little bit more than that if you really push pedal to the metal with the kind of subsidies the US has in the IRA. But that still leaves you needing to get more than 90% of the reductions by reducing fossil fuels. So to some extent, this debate between fossil fuels versus fossil fuel emissions is a little bit of a red herring, at least in the near term. In the long term, we have to develop CCS, CDR technologies, particularly for some of the hard to abate sectors, and to get to the net negative emissions that we need in the second half of the century to start to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. But in the near term, Anyone that's suggesting we can do this with CCS and CDR in the next 7 years is basically greenwashing you, and you should take it very skeptically. So we are going to be making a big push for a phase down, a phase out of fossil fuels, building on the push that India made last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, and that's got to be done in an equitable and managed way with resources, as I said, to buffer the national economies, the local communities, and the workers that are on the front lines of that transition. Urmi Goswami, this will probably be the last question given timing from the Economic Times, and I'll give this one to Jonny. The developing country invitees to the G7, Brazil, India, and others have expressed concern or opposition to the overlap or intersection between trade and climate policy, i.e. the push against CBAM. And Urmi, I just saw a Reuters piece about India filing a WTO complaint against the EU on CBAM. What kind of an outcome can we expect on the question of trade and climate policy, given that leaders from these developing countries will surely raise their concerns in the conversation this weekend? So Jonny, you want to take a swing at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. This is going to be raised. I think, you've already cited as well that WTO case, or Alden, and I think they're absolutely within their rights to do so. They've got long-standing complaints about the potential for green protectionism and so on. So the onus is really on the European Union at this particular point, but also potentially other members of the G7 if they go down this route, to communicate why they're doing what they're doing, how what they're doing is genuinely an environmental measure, and an ability to prove that, I think, is fundamental. And some of that comes down to not just dialing up domestic ambition on industrial decarbonisation at the same time. That's the only time that would make a carbon border adjustment mechanism valid. The other thing comes down to how the revenue from the CBAM is going to be used. And I think here a clear point around using CBAM revenue for international climate finance, I think, is the clearest way of bridging that divide, in terms of this not just being a revenue raising tool for rich countries, but actually recycling that revenue back for developing countries. I think is one of the key ways that the European Union might be able to sell this policy. But it does come back to that point around qualifying as an environmental measure, and that's exactly what the WTO dispute will be about. And I think it's an important thing that developing country partners do this, because it needs to be proven, and it's the onus is on developed countries to prove it. But I think there is a case to be made, and these conversations do need to be had. But I think it's also important that the overall trade and climate agenda isn't just assumed to just be about CBAMs. It's a much broader agenda. We've talked about all this stuff around multilateral trade reform and so on, where developing countries have a much stronger interest, I think, in there being genuine progress. So I think there's much more that can be done in terms of partnerships going forwards, if we kind of take this slightly more zoomed out perspective rather than just purely focusing on CBAMs in the context of trade and climate discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I would also say that India co-chairs the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative with the UK. And you could say that if we can make progress on reducing the carbon intensity of steel, aluminum, cement, other trade-exposed heavy industries through voluntary standards and through that process that India co-leads, you reduce the need for CBAMs. If there's no discrepancy between the carbon intensity of products in different countries, there's no border fee to assess. So ultimately, what we want to see is incentives for all countries to reduce carbon emissions from the heavy industry sector, and that's hopefully what will be the outcome, rather than trade wars and filings of the WTO and disputes. So we need to see how that part of the agenda goes. And Urmi, we will be watching what India does with the G20 energy and climate ministers and clean energy ministers, emission innovation summits in India in July, to see what signals we get there. Well, we're over the top of the hour. We don't want to keep you. Thank you to all three panelists for a great discussion here. If you have additional questions for any of us or other colleagues at E3G, please feel free to send them through to Dido and to Will Yates. We will be monitoring, obviously, the discussions in Hiroshima over the weekend, and we will have reactions when the final communique is released. There may be a Twitter Spaces briefing. There may be other things going on over the weekend. We'll keep you posted on those. Again, this has been on the record. Feel free to use any of it in your stories. And thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion. Take care, everyone.
Many thanks.
Bye.
Bye.